You're with Johnny Vedmore on today's News Talk, TNT.
I'm here with Judith Brown on the Johnny Vedmore Show, and we're talking about loads of different things. And when you were saying, one thing that you were saying there, there was impossible to see the divide between the different shades of blue, I would say, between the Labour Party and the Conservatives nowadays. And again, and you were saying it was because of obviously they introduced roughly the same policy, and that's why they become so close. And now, if I go back to some of my research in the second of Schwab articles, I say about how Herman Kahn was writing up memorandums for the State Department where he was saying, we need to train leadership groups outside of society. And then he was one of the mentors for Schwab to go back and then create the World Economic Forum, which is, of course, a public policy institute where a lot of our parties get their policy from. So do you think that the parties like the Labour Party, and I know this is a bit off topic, but the Labour Party and the Conservatives are just getting their policies from the same place, and they're now indistinguishable from each other?
Well, I think that there is a world government, and I think that what I've seen is that the control of information has got much tighter, especially since 2020. Obviously, I started my research into sort of like media censorship, which actually started with looking at particularly at Arab issues, because I'd worked in Lebanon and Yemen, and what I'd seen with my own eyes was very different to what I expected to see. That was in the 1990s, and so I wanted to explore why those differences had occurred and what had influenced the mainstream media to produce images which, to my mind, weren't accurate. For example, when I went to the Middle East, both to Lebanon and Yemen. In Lebanon, I worked with Palestinians, but both the Lebanese, the Palestinians, and when I was in Yemen, the Yemeni people, they pulled me into their hearts. They were warm, they were loving, they were sort of very welcoming, they were very open, they were tolerant of religion, they were everything that I didn't expect to see. When I was in Lebanon, because I was working in South Lebanon, inevitably I met Hezbollah people, and I thought that they were all going to be evil people, but they were all, very helpful. And also when I was working in Lebanon, it was the Israeli occupation, and I was really shocked to see what it meant to be living under occupation, because I wasn't living in an occupied area, but I was adjacent to it, very close to it. So you could see the sort of like the bombs and the things going on. I saw the new graves at Cana, which was a UN shelter that was bombed by Israel, and then when I went to Yemen, I uncovered lots of stories that I hadn't had any idea had been going on. The victimization of Yemen because it had voted the wrong way in the Gulf War, and the way that had affected the wealth and the lives of people there. And so that was what sort of made me start to do research. And then later I did research into the story selection and the media, particularly when the Yemen war happened. I was very interested that was almost wiped from the mainstream media altogether. It had occasions when it was shown, but not very much. And so I did work on story selection then. But I think that the control of the media has been much greater since 2020. And looking at the fact check platforms really started I think the very earliest ones were about 2008. But the majority of them started from sort of like, the mid from 2015 onwards, and also media literacy training programs started at about that time, and then there was the Trusted News Initiative and one or two other projects that control the mainstream media that came about. but they really were almost like set to go into operation at the time of the COVID outbreak. And I think that what I felt then, because I'd been working in refugee health camps, sometimes in urban programs, the bread and butter of my work really was infection control. I knew the WHO guidelines, you know, it was my bread and butter. I knew them. I knew what I had to do. I didn't even have to look up. I knew what the rules were because it was my job. It was my area of expertise. And so therefore, I was sort of like really surprised when nothing that happened that I expected to happen. And then because I'd done all of this work on media censorship and propaganda, and you know, and I'd done quite a lot of academic work and also reading up until that point. So I sort of like I could see that these sort of like short repetitive statements were very typical of a propaganda campaign. And I think that the main thing was that I felt very isolated. I didn't know anyone who felt the same as me. You know, my neighbors were all sort of walking around looking terrified. And I just felt sure that, because I kept thinking, well, a lot of doctors must be much better qualified than me. I mean, I was a very well qualified nurse. I'd got a master's degree. So I wasn't sort of, you know, I was a nurse with a lot of education. But I really felt that doctors would all start thinking the same as me and that it would all be over. So I went through the first sort of like lockdown very confidently, because I was so sure that the medical profession would all say, no, I'm not going to be part of this. I was just totally confident. And but of course nothing happened. Yeah. And then I eventually a group called Heart was set up in UK, and I joined that. That was sort of like medical professionals mostly, and then after that, I someone who Piers Robinson, who's a professor of propaganda studies, he said that they had a censorship group where they were investigating censorship at Panda. So I moved to Panda, and I've been researching at Panda since. And that's where I've looked at the fact check platforms.
Yeah. Listen, Judith, we'll run out of time for today, but you're going to have to come back on the show for a longer stint. You're going to have to come on for a 40-minute segment because I've got loads of questions to ask you and loads of other questions that came from this. You are a fantastic lady. Keep up the good work. And I'm so glad there's someone doing what you're doing, which is fact-checking the fact-checkers. That's exactly what we want.
This is Johnny Vedmore on today's News Talk TNT.